The first thing Elias noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind and not the calm that comes after answers, but an artificial silence, perfectly muted, as if something essential had been removed without warning, a silence that felt engineered rather than discovered, pressing gently yet persistently against his awareness. He sat alone in a dimly lit room where the glow of a screen painted weak shadows on the walls, the city outside continuing its restless rhythm of movement, sound, and purpose, while inside his mind something subtle yet irreversible had fractured. For years, Elias believed he was the thinker of his thoughts, the owner of his emotions, the author of his choices, the central figure directing the flow of his inner world. But that belief quietly collapsed the moment a question appeared without invitation, without origin, without intent. Who decided to think this thought? He reached for an answer instinctively, but the instant he searched, the thought dissolved, replaced by another, and then another, cascading endlessly, until he noticed a disturbing pattern emerging beneath the content itself. Thoughts didn't wait for permission. They did not ask for identity. They arrived fully formed, complete with emotion, urgency, and narrative, like messages transmitted from a place he could not access, edited by a system he could not observe. Neuroscience had names for this process. Terms like prefrontal cortex neural firing, predictive processing, and unconscious initiation occurring milliseconds before conscious awareness. But scientific language failed to soften the existential impact, because if the brain decides before awareness knows, then the identity-claiming ownership is not the source but the echo. Humans crave control more than truth, and the brain evolved not to reveal reality but to survive it, shaping perception not for accuracy but for usefulness. Elias remembered reading that consciousness is delayed, that the brain initiates action while awareness arrives late to take credit, transforming free will into a carefully maintained illusion, a comforting narrative designed to preserve psychological stability and social coherence. He lifted his hand and placed it back on the table, observing closely, and noticed how the sensation of deciding followed the movement itself, how intention appeared after execution, and in that moment he understood something deeply unsettling. The mind narrates while the brain acts, and the narrator lies convincingly. What disturbed him even more was the realization that there is no single you inside the head, no central command center directing experience, only a collection of competing systems, neural networks responsible for fear, desire, attachment, memory, logic, reward, and pain, each operating according to its own priorities, often in conflict, stitched together by the brain into a story that feels continuous and personal. Identity was not truth but glue, a survival strategy designed to keep the organism coherent enough to function in a complex social world. Pain stayed longer than joy, not because the mind was broken, but because the brain assigned weight unequally, carving deeper neural pathways for negative experiences, prioritizing threat over pleasure, not out of cruelty but protection. Trauma was not stored as narrative memory but as pattern, encoded in muscle tension, breath, tone of voice, sudden silence, or subtle shifts in expression, triggering the body to react before the mind could explain, forcing the mind to invent reasons afterward in order to maintain the illusion of control. Elias had always believed himself to be rational, proud of his logic and reasoning, but now he saw that logic usually arrived late, hired to justify emotional decisions already made, because emotions are ancient and logic is young, and when emotional bonds form, logic steps aside entirely. The brain does not ask whether something is true, it asks whether it is safe, familiar, or socially stabilizing, which is why humans remain in harmful relationships, why belief systems survive overwhelming evidence, why fear overrides reason, even in intelligent minds. What Elias perceived as reality was not the world itself, but a prediction, constructed moment by moment by the brain using memory, expectation, sensory input, and survival priorities. Vision was not passive reception, but active construction. Perception and internal simulation calibrated for survival rather than truth, and reality was constantly filtered, edited, simplified, and adjusted. Color did not exist outside the mind. Time did not flow the way it felt. And even the present moment was already slightly in the past by the time awareness arrived, leaving the brain forever catching up, never fully arriving, never truly present. If the brain constructed reality, then every human lived inside a simulation, not a digital one but a biological one, with each mind running its own version based on personal history, emotional conditioning, and neurological wiring, which explained a loneliness Elias had always felt but never fully understood. A loneliness that did not come from being alone but from never fully sharing the same reality as another person. Language became an approximation, connection, a fragile negotiation between separate internal worlds that could overlap but never fully merge. At night, the brain loosened its grip. The prefrontal cortex reduced its control. Thoughts wandered freely. Anxiety amplified. And existential questions surfaced not because night was special, but because the mind's defenses were lowered and the brain stopped pretending that everything made sense. Ego, Elias realized, was not arrogance, but protection, a psychological mask built to navigate social hierarchies, expectations, and threats. And without it, the mind would dissolve into uncertainty. Yet ego also generated suffering by clinging to identity, comparing endlessly, resisting change, fearing loss, and especially fearing death. Because ego was temporary and the brain despised endings. Fear of death was not spiritual but neurological because the brain could not imagine non-existence and interpreted death as threat rather than mystery, prompting humans to construct religions, philosophies, ideologies, and narratives, not necessarily because they were objectively true, but because they reduced uncertainty and stabilized the nervous system. Belief functioned as medicine for the brain, regulating fear, creating predictability, providing meaning to suffering, and the brain did not care whether a belief was accurate, only whether it reduced distress. As Elias sat quietly and observed thoughts arise without chasing or judging them, something subtle occurred. He noticed a gap between thoughts, a silent space where no identity existed, where no narrative was active, where no problem demanded solving. In that space there was no fear, no ego, no past, no future, only awareness observing without effort. For the first time he understood that thoughts were not the thinker, and emotions were not the self, but temporary events arising and dissolving within a deeper field of consciousness that did not speak, did not judge, and did not need to survive. The silence he had noticed at the beginning returned, but this time it was no longer artificial or unsettling. It was vast, alive, neutral, and honest. Elias realized then that the mind had never been broken, only misunderstood, because the brain was a survival machine. The self was a story told to maintain continuity, and awareness was what remained when the story paused. And in that pause, for the first time in his life, he was not searching for meaning, not defending identity, not trying to control experience, but simply present, watching reality arise and dissolve without resistance, understanding that peace was not something to achieve, but something revealed when the brain no longer needed to protect a self that was never truly there.